Hello, I'm Michael. To many of its fans, Metroid represents some of the best games Nintendo has to offer, competing with the best of Super Mario and The Legend of Zelda. Critically speaking, this is true, as Metroid has reached the highest highs as Mario and Zelda. Though there's one key difference. Metroid's output is far lower, and there's two time periods where the series has gone on a hiatus, from 1994 to 2002, and 2010 to 2016. Aside from Metroid having far lower sales than Mario and Zelda, let's investigate other reasons why the series might would go on a hiatus where Mario and Zelda did not. Many probably didn't realize Super Metroid at the time was intended to be the finale of the series, as stated by its series director and producer Yoshio Sakamoto in an interview from Super Metroid's Japanese guidebook. Sakamoto would go on to say, "This time I wanted to complete the Metroid series. Also, I wanted to bring back an old enemy, a nemesis would be revived. And for the sake of portraying an image of the showdown with Samus, this time it could only happen on planet Zebes. This is what I thought. The battle between Samus and Mother Brain would come to an end. I wanted to show what happens at the end of Metroid." In a 2003 interview, Sakamoto would reiterate this, as well as explain why there was no Metroid game for the N64 or the Game Boy Color. Although there are many reasons, the first is that the story was tentatively completed with Super Metroid. After that, I was development assistant for the handheld game department, so it was difficult for me to develop software for the N64. There were also discussions with licensees, but they weren't settled in any definite form. However, the power of expression on the N64 was also a little too limited for making a realistic game. As for the Game Boy Color, it would have been similar to the design of the Famicom, and so would have been unfavorably compared to the Super Famicom version. Those are some of the reasons, and as a result, there was a silent period of 9 years. Super Metroid being the original finale to the series would still be acknowledged years later in 2010's Metroid Other M, where its Japanese guidebook will refer to the original three games as the original story, and Fusion and Other M as after stories. In a 2010 interview, Sakamoto would elaborate on why he didn't make a N64 Metroid game, as well as a third party that Nintendo had contacted also turned down making a Metroid game for the N64. "I was actually thinking about the possibility of a Metroid game for N64, but I felt that I shouldn't be the one making the game. When I held the N64 controller in my hands, I just couldn't imagine how it could be used to move Samus around. So for me, it was just too early to personally make a 3D Metroid game at that time." Also, I know this isn't a direct answer to your question, but Nintendo at the time approached another company and asked them if they would make an N64 version of Metroid, and their response was that no, they could not. They turned it down, saying that unfortunately they didn't have the confidence to create an N64 Metroid game that could compare favorably with Super Metroid. That's something I take as a compliment to what we achieved with Super Metroid. So there were three reasons why Metroid went on a hiatus from 1994 to 2002. 1. The Metroid story was effectively complete with Super Metroid. 2. Sakamoto's position had changed and it made it difficult for him to work on N64 games, and he didn't feel the Game Boy Color can make a follow-up to Super Metroid. 3. Nintendo had actually contacted a third-party studio, however they turned it down, feeling that they couldn't compare with Super Metroid. Regarding the hiatus from 2010 to 2016, many felt that this was the effect of Metroid Other M not meeting internal sales expectations from Nintendo. And whilst it did not sell as well as the previous titles, there's no real evidence to support the claims that Other M's less than ideal sales were the reason for this hiatus. Instead, it seems mostly to be a creative decision. At this time, the Metroid Prime trilogy by Retro Studios had been completed. However, it still teased another game in the series with Silex. We will see this year with Metroid Prime 4 Beyond. The reason why this game did not come out sooner, despite Prime 3 having a teaser for it back in 2007, was likely not due to sales at all, but due to Retro Studios wishing to move on from the Metroid series and work on other Nintendo series. Many staff members at Retro Studios felt fatigued on working on the Metroid brand for so many years in a row. Some actually felt fatigued back when Metroid Prime 2 was released.
I mean, that's why I left after Prime 3, though. I was fatigued. Not of I was sort of fatigued of Metroid, but yeah, it was largely why I ended up leaving Retro after Prime 3.
After Prime 2, Retro was really trying to think of what we wanted to move forward with, what was next. We were starting to feel franchise fatigue with the Prime series.
2008 would then see several key members of Retro Studios, director Mark Passini, art director Todd Cutter, and Jack Matthews leave to form their own studio, Armature Studio. The remaining Retro staff, still feeling fatigued of Metroid, would go on to work on other Nintendo series such as Donkey Kong Country and Mario Kart. They would release these games from 2010 to 2018. It would not be until a decade after the Metroid Prime trilogy was released for Wii that they would be announced to have been working on Metroid Prime 4 after it had restarted development after the initial development in 2017 failed to meet Nintendo's internal standards. They would also release Metroid Prime Remastered in 2023, and Metroid Prime 4 is slated to release this year in 2025. Despite Retro stepping away from Metroid Prime in 2009, series producer Kensuke Tanabe would actually still be working on a Metroid game during this time. Tanabe actually had the idea of making a Federation-centered Metroid Prime game during the development of Metroid Prime 3 in 2007. The initial startup of development for what would become Metroid Prime Federation Force actually started in 2009, working with Next Level Games. In between the 2009 DSi attempt and the 2016 finalized release, Tanabe would work with Next Level Games to make Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon in 2013. For Sakamoto's side, he actually wanted to make a Metroid game around the time of 2012 or 2013, just a couple years after the release of Other M. As stated in another 2017 interview, development for Metroid Samus Returns began around 2015. So the behind-the-scenes reasons for the 2010 to 2016 hiatus was entirely a creative decision. And it's worth noting that a Metroid game was actually in development since 2009, even though it didn't get fully released until 2016. And another Metroid game would be put into development a few years later in 2015 and released in 2017. Though the primary reason why this hiatus was felt was the lack of any new Metroid Prime games from Retro Studios, and this was because the staff had felt fatigued from the Metroid brand and wanted to work on other games, with several key staff members leaving to form other studios. It's also worth noting that Sakamoto had initially wanted to make Metroid Dread for the Nintendo DS much earlier than its 2021 release on the Nintendo Switch. In a promotional video, Sakamoto mentions he attempted to make the game 2 times before he would eventually make it in its third, finalized form on the Nintendo Switch with Mercury Steam. I'm not entirely sure when these attempts were made, but it seems to be around 2005 or 2006 when it was initially developed for the Nintendo DS. It seems after the game wasn't going exactly how he had wanted on the DS, he would move on to make another title in the Metroid series which he had been actually thinking about since Super Metroid release, where he wanted to make Samus the star of an action game. Adding to this, after Fusion release, he indicated that he wanted to make a game involving the story around Samus and Adam. These two ideas seemed to come together in Metroid Other M. After this point, he still seemed to have been thinking about Metroid Dread and still wanted to make the game. However, he first wanted to remake Metroid 2, the one 2D Metroid game that he was not involved in, and use this opportunity to collaborate with Mercury Steam, who would go on to be his partner for Metroid Dread. One other thing to consider is that unlike Zelda series producer Eiji Aonuma, who has exclusively worked on the Legend of Zelda series starting with Ocarina of Time, both Yoshio Sakamoto and Kensuke Tanabe work on other Nintendo IP besides Metroid. Due to this, it's sometimes possible their creative desires to work on series other than Metroid may not align with Metroid fans' desires for more Metroid games. I feel we should respect their decisions to work on other non-Metroid games, even if it means sometimes us Metroid fans won't get a new game in the series. This is because they may want to stay creatively fresh and not be working on the same franchise repeatedly again and again, which we saw what happened with Retro Studios. They began to feel fatigued by working on the same series over and over. A creative dead end is something Sakamoto had actually talked about in an interview when marketing Metroid Other M, going on to clarify his reasons for not trying to make another Metroid game like Super Metroid, and instead making different styled Metroid games. Of course, there was the choice for me to work on a game more similar to Super Metroid, but I don't know if that would represent a true evolution of the series. We might be able to come up with a better Super Metroid, but someday, sometime, we would work ourselves into a creative dead end if we were simply moving forward in one direction. I, myself, have been seeking new stimulations and new playfields with the games that I've been working on, so at least I am trying to avoid repeating the same things. Finally, I would like to address that during all of this, Shigeru Miyamoto seems to be a big supporter of the Metroid series, and is actually one of the main people at Nintendo wanting more Metroid games, even if the actual directors of the games are working on other games. This can be seen in an interview for the Nintendo 64 when he was asked, "What remaining 16-bit sequels might we see on the Nintendo 64? He would answer, "Well, Metroid." Although I'm not the Metroid producer, whenever I come across opportunity in a company meeting, I try to suggest it. He would actually go on to become the producer for the original Metroid Prime on GameCube. He would then suggest Retro Studios could have been a good pick for Metroid on the Wii U, and he even came up with some ideas on how to use the gamepad, which could be conceptually seen in Nintendo Land. This all goes to show that even someone as high up and powerful as Shigeru Miyamoto within Nintendo does still want more Metroid games to come out, and that these hiatuses seem to be entirely a decision from the creatives involved in the series' creation, and not necessarily a factor of sales, which does seem to line up with Nintendo's satisfaction with Metroid Samus Return's fairly poor sales, as well as series producer Sakamoto's philosophy that games can be art and not necessarily a commodity to just be sold.
I think that defining games as art is a delicate subject. Of course, what we're making is an entertainment commodity, and if people define art as something you're only going to appreciate by watching, I don't think I should make games in that format as well. On the other hand, you could simply say, no, a video game is no more than a simple commodity, and the only important factor is sales. Well, again, that is not something that interests me, and it's not a view that I share. So, if I can talk about my interpretation, I'm always trying to incorporate some artistic nature into my games, but the most important element is entertainment. So if there is a way that artistic elements can be worked into the game naturally, then that is a mission I will always try to accomplish.
I hope you're having a good day or night. Bye. See you next mission.